With the addition of Grand Cathay to Warhammer 3 as a core race, it has really opened up the possibilities for a lot of other minor players to make it into the game. We could realistically see races like Ind, Koresh and Nippon added to the map sometime in the game's life cycle. At some point in the future, we will speculate on what we might get for these races, though today we are looking at another race entirely. Our focus for this video is the Hobgoblin Khanate, which rule over the eastern steppes and are a constant thorn in the side of Grand Cathay. The Hobgoblins are often talked about in relation to the Chaos Dwarfs, and if Creative Assembly decide that the only Hobgoblins they want to give us are those snivelling, cowardly, broken gobbos who live under the thumb of the Chaos Dwarfs, then I for one will be disappointed. I believe we need to see the Hobgoblin Khanate added to the game in all its glory, and the perfect opportunity is the pre-order bonus. They have enough lords to choose from, so we could get 2 legendary lords and factions quite comfortably. They could be based on existing models for a lot of their units, and they could give us interesting new horde races with their own unique mechanics that can give Grand Cathay something to fight against other than Chaos Demons. So let's take a look at what we know about the Hobgoblins, and the Khanate in particular. The Hobgoblins are one of the many greenskin races that infest the Warhammer world, though they differ from their kin in a number of ways. They are more cunning and treacherous than their brethren, and they are much taller as well, just below the height of the average man. They do not march to war along with their fellow goblins, nor do they join in the great orc wars, though they will partake in opportunistic looting alongside other greenskins when they feel the need. To many, the Khanate is known as the Scourge of the East, and they are hated and feared in equal measure. Their powerful hordes are unwelcome in the old world, as other greenskins consider them too untrustworthy. This is truly remarkable, considering how dishonest and devious the average goblin can be. The Hobgoblins of the steppe primarily fall under the reign of the great Hobgobla Khan. It is said that his empire is the largest kingdom in the known world, and the Hobgoblin of the Khanate are truly a different breed to their enslaved cousins, who live a life licking the boots of the Chaos Dwarfs. Living their lives in the open plains of the steppe, they are nomadic and spend their time raiding travellers along the Silk Road and pillaging the lands of Grand Cathay. When they go to war, the entire plain shakes with the impact of their innumerable hordes, and they can match any force in open battle. So, if the Hobgoblin Khanate is to come to Warhammer 3 as the pre-order DLC, or perhaps as a mini campaign pack further down the road, they could certainly provide a different experience to the races we have encountered so far. If they continue to be portrayed as a fantasy version of the Mongolian Empire, there is no doubt that they could bring a different style of play. With a roster based mostly on fast, powerful cavalry, with the ability to skirmish at core strength, they could be a great change of pace from the current army playstyles. So let's put together a possible roster which we could see if the Hobgoblin Khanate are released onto the eastern steppes, to cause havoc for Cathay and the inhabitants of the Darklands. Since the Hobgoblin Khanate is based on the exploits of the Mongolians in the Middle Ages, I will draw from the army structure that the Mongolians used to a fair extent. We start off with the infantry options. Now, while the Mongolians are most well known for their prowess as mounted archers, they did include infantry in their armies, as cavalry are little good for subjugating conquered cities. I could envision 4 or 5 different infantry units that could possibly be recruited. The lowest tier troops would be the slaves. The Mongolians often use slaves as fodder to push their war machines or as human shields, and on occasion force them to fight with crude weapons. In game, the slaves, or Hasha as the Mongolians called them, would come with no armour, just tattered rags, and would carry crude spears, not even having a shield. They would be considered expendable troops and would not affect the morale of any Hobgoblins should they break and flee. As Game 3 is getting a siege rework, it would be nice if the siege equipment built when attacking a city came with a detachment of Hasha. Whether that be battering rams or towers, they would push the equipment into place and defend themselves if attacked, but not be detachable from the siege equipment. This would be very fitting, as the Hobgoblins would sacrifice these slaves to get their war machines in place for the assault on the wars to begin. The first tier of actual Hobgoblin troops would be the Cherik. which is a term that the Mongolians used for their militia forces. These troops would be lightly armoured and come with sword and shield, or spear and shield. I could see these troops being the equivalent of Bretonia's men-at-arms while in melee combat. On top of their melee infantry role, they would also have the ability to fire arrows from range, much like the Lothian Sea Guard can for the High Elves. This first tier of troops would be using simple bows and have a range slightly lower than the Bretonian bowmen, with no armour-piercing damage. Our next tier of infantry would be based on the Mongolian Kashik, which were a well-armoured and trained force capable of fighting on foot or horse. Here they would come in two infantry variants. The first would be equipped with a sword and shield, and the second would be equipped with a guando. Both variants would wear heavy armour that would put them in a similar class to the High Elf Silverin Guard. They would be able to hold the line for longer than the standard troops, and would come with increased melee abilities and leadership. Much like the first tier of troops, the Kashik would come with the ability to attack from range. They would, however, use a composite bow, which would allow for longer range and more powerful projectiles. These would not, however, be armour-piercing. The top tier of infantry for the Hobgoblin Khanate would be a Khan's Guard, who would be equipped with a magical guando enchanted by the Khan shamans. They would be more capable in combat, with very high leadership, and would bolster the morale of nearby troops. These troops would be an excellent anti-large option on the battlefield. The final infantry option for the Hobgoblin Khanate would be the Sneaky Gits, which are similar in function to the Goblins' Nasty Skulkers. They would come with dual swords, which are poisoned, and would be an effective anti-infantry option with Stalk and Vanguard deploy. They would also come with a unit ability to shroud themselves in battle and withdraw from the engagement, leaving their opponents confused and unable to give chase for several seconds. In a similar fashion to the militia and Kashik infantry, the Sneaky Gits would also have a ranged option. There would be a much shorter distance, perhaps 40 to 50 meters, with poison-tipped arrows. They would also have less ammo, with their ranged attack intended to soften up a target before they enter melee. Well, that wraps up the infantry options we could see. Now let's take a look at the bread and butter of the Hobgoblin Khanate, the cavalry. First, we have the Hobhounds. These are a basic unit much like any other race's low-level beasts, and would be used for harassing missile units and artillery, or for chasing fleeing units off the battlefield. They would be very quick and have a tough hide that will block some missiles, but would not last long if charged into the front-line infantry. Next up is the basic Hobgoblin Wolf Rider, wearing light armour, who would come equipped with either a sword or a spear, and of course a shield. They would be mounted on giant wolves, which are larger and much more ferocious than the wolves that the goblins ride. They would be very fast and come with a good charge bonus. Their skill in melee would see them able to go blow for blow with similar low-level cavalry, but lack of armour would be a disadvantage. Best used for flanking manoeuvres and for taking out archers and war machines, or for chasing off the enemy's skirmishing units or mounted archers. The next tier of cavalry would be the mounted Kashik. These troops are well armoured and come equipped with either a sword and shield or a lance. Their wolves would also have some degree of armour, and as such they would be slightly slower than the standard cavalry, but they would pack a much harder punch on the charge. They would be well suited to engagements against most infantry, and capable of taking on all but the toughest of enemy cavalry. Now the top tier of cavalry would be the Kemte Ud, which were the most elite of the Kashik Guard in Mongolian society. These would be very well armoured and would be equipped with a magical lance and shield. Their giant wolf would also be heavily armoured and would be the equal of any cavalry in the old world. Much like the Khan's Guard infantry, they would bolster the morale of nearby troops and be an excellent anti-large option for the Khanate. They would also come with a Guardian trait to give nearby lords a physical resistance bonus. So we can see the army is taking shape, but now we come to what might be the Hobgoblin Khanate's biggest strength, their ranged cavalry. There would be 4 tiers of ranged cavalry that the Khanate could draw from. The lowest tier would be the basic Hobgoblin mounted archer, able to fire while moving, using a standard bow with a range slightly less than a Bretonian bowman. They would come with light armour and would use swords and shield if engaged in melee. Their wolves would be among the fastest, allowing them to outpace most cavalry in the game. The second tier of missile cavalry would be very similar, but come with a composite bow, and would be better trained in archery and able to fire while moving in a 360-degree arc. They would have a better range with their arrows, doing more damage, but they would not be armor piercing. Much like the previous unit, they would be armed with a sword and shield if engaged in melee. The third tier of ranged cavalry would be the Turak-Ut archers, who would be highly trained with the bow. They would have armor similar to the mounted Keshik and use compound bows, and once again be able to fire while moving in a 360-degree arc. They would also come with an ability where they can fire off a single volley of arrows that would slow the targeted unit and cause armor sundering magical damage. The top tier of mounted archers are the Kuruchi. These are the best of the best, with an increased range and accuracy, using magical bows which cause armor-piercing damage. Much like the lower tiers of mounted archers, they are able to fire while moving in a 360-degree arc. They would be very well armoured, as would their mounts, and they would be able to defend themselves very well against all but the best heavy cavalry. Their magical missiles would be very effective offensively, and you could think of them as a well-armoured, mounted version of the Sisters of Avalon. Our next category of troops is the Monstrous Cavalry, which would use Yugagia as mounts. These are large beasts like bison which roam the Mongolian plains. In-game, they live on the edge of the Chaos Wastes along the eastern steppes and have been corrupted by the Chaos energies around them. They would be large beasts, similar in size to the Kislev Bear Cavalry. Having been exposed to so much Chaos corruption, they would warp the air around them, causing enemies engaged with them to suffer penalties to their melee attack and weapon damage. The Hobgoblins that ride these massive beasts have also been corrupted by the energies of Chaos, and would appear with welts and legions on their bodies as the Chaos corruption consumes them. As the beasts are so large, there would be 2 Hobgoblins on the back of a Yugagia, both of which would be heavily armoured, with the first having a lance and shield, and the second firing with a magical bow from range, and using a sword and shield while in melee combat. Their magical weapons would cause armor sundering damage, and as they ride on such a monstrous and chaotic beast, they would cause terror. These would be the Hobgoblin's ultimate killing machine. If we wanted to give the Hobgoblin Khanate a chariot of some sort, then it would be pulled by these beasts. But with the 2 riders on Yugagia, I think this would fill the same role, and the chariot would not be needed. Next, we move on to the monsters available to the Khanate, and first up they would be the Yeti. These mythical creatures would come from the mountain ranges between the eastern steppes and the lands of Cathay, and be similar in size to an ogre. They would cause terror and have large claws to cause armor-piercing damage. They would come in units of 5 to 6 models. The Yetis would provide the Khanate with an effective infantry support unit that could help keep the front lines from buckling. Any units within 40 meters of the Yetis in the Hobgoblin army would have a high morale, as knowing these ferocious beasts are with you would make them fight that much harder. Yetis could also come with some form of shout, where a cone-shaped magical effect can be targeted on the enemy. Any units hit by this ability would suffer a large hit to morale and would take damage from the blast. We could possibly give the Khanate access to trolls of some kind as well. If these dumb beasts choose to fight with other greenskins, they may well join the hordes of the Khanate on their raids into Grand Cathay. It would give the Khanate another unit which could be focused on anti-infantry to differentiate them from the Yetis. A lot of other races seem to use a giant of one type or another, and since the eastern steppes are close to the ancient home of the giants, it would make sense for the Hobgoblins to have some in their army. The Khanate could effectively take the giant from the greenskins roster, and that would be perfectly fine. The largest of our beasts, and the one that would cost the most Charlemagnes, comes from the Monstrous Arcanum, the Dreadmaw. This nasty beast would be under the control of the Shamans, and would be the Khanate's big-ticket model. The Dreadmaws live in the Chaos Wastes and Eastern Steppes, and are one of the most vile creatures to inhabit the Warhammer world. They resemble huge worms that chew through the earth at startling speed, only to surface in a blast of earth and stone to catch its prey in its huge gaping maw. These beasts would be a terrifying sight on the battlefield, causing terror and disrupting unit formations wherever they surfaced. There is one issue, however. Could Creative Assembly get the AI for the burrowing and surfacing attacks to work well enough that they don't look out of place on the battlefield? I'm not trying to diss CA here, I just think it would be quite the challenge to pull off. Let's move on to the flying units for the Khanate, of which there are two. First, we have the giant vultures, huge birds that are able to lift a wolf clean off the ground and have been known to crush a hobgoblin with their talons. They will be a single entity unit, similar in power to a great eagle. Their talons would give them armor-piercing damage and a high weapon strength. However, they would have a low melee defense and be susceptible to missile fire, as they would have a soft underbelly and their feathers will provide little protection from missiles. The second flying unit would be much more fierce and well armoured. The cockatrice would provide the Khanate with a unique flyer that could take on a griffin or pretty much any other flyer except perhaps dragons. When a cockatrice is desperate, it goes berserk, and would as such suffer from the rage mechanic. This makes it overcome its cowardly nature. The beast would also come with a magical gaze ability that could petrify its enemies. This would freeze a unit for a short period, drastically lowering its armor and resistances, making it very vulnerable to the cockatrice's attacks or to missile fire from nearby ranged units. This ability would even work against the greatest of beasts, such as dragons and hydras, though the effect may not last quite as long. It's been known for some cockatrice to also spew acidic vomit upon their foes. This ability could also be added to give them some additional damage options. The Mongolians are not known for their artillery, but they did use it to great effect in cases where the enemy cities would refuse to surrender. They were known to use a catapult that fired rocks, or in later years, gunpowder bombs, and they also used Chinese rockets in some instances. The Hobgoblin Khanate will have access to a few of these for their roster. The catapult would be an artillery piece with about 250 meters range, and would have the ability to fire rocks, with bombs being an option locked behind a technology. They would be operated by the basic Hobgoblin militia troops. The rocket batteries would be the top tier artillery piece for the Hobgoblin Khanate. With a range similar to a cannon, they would have a large area of impact and cause terror. That pretty much covers all the standard troops, so now let's take a look at the lords and heroes. We start off with the possible generic lord options, of which there are two. The first is the standard Hobgoblin Khan. The Khan would be a capable melee specialist that would come with a giant wolf mount as standard, but could be changed to be on foot or could ride on the back of a Yukagir. As Hobgoblins are known to be extremely treacherous, they would come with a loyalty meter that the player would need to keep an eye on, as you never know when your Khan may attempt to betray you. The other generic option would be a Shaman, which would be a magic user much less capable in melee. They would come on foot as standard, with the option to be mounted on a giant wolf or on a Yeti's shoulders, much like the Rat Ogres can be a mount for the Skaven. They could also be mounted on the Cockatrice, giving them an aerial base from which to cast their spells. Speaking of which, the Shaman would come with the Little Wild Lore of Magic and access to the Lore of Beasts, along with several abilities for buffing the weapons of the Khanate's troops. On to the generic heroes. Here we have three options. First is the Tamashi, which is a Kashik commander, a melee specialist who is heavily armoured and would wield a Guando on foot or a lancer's shield if mounted. His mount options would be the giant wolf or the Yukagir. He would have several skills for buffing his melee prowess, and would also have skills that would bolster the morale of nearby troops. The second hero option would be a Shaman, who is pretty much identical to the Lord version. Our final hero option would be the Hobgoblin Assassin. This hero would come with a poison bow and poison blades, with a few different options for poisons available in his skill tree. On the battlefield, they would be able to defend themselves against most troops, but would not last long if engaged by an enemy melee specialist lord or hero. They would have access to the same ability as the Sneaky Gits, which would allow them to escape from an engagement that is unfavourable to them, and they would come with Stalk and Vanguard deployment. Alongside the generic Lord and Hero options, we of course would need some named characters. We have a few options that we can choose from. For the pre-order, or perhaps a mini campaign pack if CA decides to make them further down the line, 2 Lords and 1 Hero should suffice. Our first named character would be none other than Hobgoblin Khan himself. Known as the Great Khan, or Khan of Khans, Hobgobla is a fierce warrior who leads the largest of the Hobgoblin clans. It is said his horde, when assembled for conquest, covers the entire horizon end to end. He has fought many battles and committed many raids against Grand Cathay, and the Dragon Emperor maintains several fortresses on his western border to defend against the incursions by the Great Khan. He rides an abnormally large and ferocious hobhound, which has been warped by the chaos energies that taint the eastern steppes. The Khan is a terrifying opponent, with a devastating charge and his great sword able to cleave a man's head clean off. His hobhound is so corrupted by the chaotic powers that its 3 heads constantly snap at his enemies when in melee, each affected by the warp in its own way, causing a different form of damage. The Khan is an excellent archer as well as melee combatant, and is able to fire his bow while moving in a 360-degree arc, like the best archers of the Khanate. His bow is made from the thigh bone of an ogre he once hunted, and is able to fire armor-piercing missiles that can be devastating to even the most well-armored knight. Such is his prowess on the battlefield, that any hobgoblins serving in his army are inspired to perform the most heroic of deeds, something that goes against their very nature. All mounted warriors would inflict additional damage from range and would be able to suffer greater casualties before beginning to waver or flee if in the Great Khan's army. The Great Khan's starting position would be in the eastern steppes, where his hordes would face off against the Hung tribes and raid the lands of Grand Cathay. The second character that could act as a legendary lord would be Ghazrak Khan, known to the inhabitants of the Old World as the Terror of the East. The great Hobgoblin Khan dispatched Ghazrak to the Old World to learn of the abilities and tactics of the peoples there, no doubt wanting to learn their weaknesses before staging an invasion. In Tilia, Ghazrak built a reputation for savagery and prowess in battle. The mercenary army that he leads in the Old World won countless victories and was even hired to destroy a Lamian vampire, Maria Sarosa. Ghazrak was eager to hunt such a beast, having never fought her kind before, and on the banks of the river Remo, their forces clashed. A huge horde of undead were flanked by Ghazrak's riders, and he boldly led a charge up the centre, directly for the vampire. He made short work of her, cleaving her head clean off, and causing her army to crumble to dust. Ghazrak would ride a giant wolf and be an excellent melee combatant. He would come with a scimitar able to cut through any armour, as if through butter, and would wear the demon head helm, magically bound to defend Ghazrak once he would be wounded, as such giving him increased resistances to magical and physical attacks once it had been triggered. Ghazrak would start in the Darklands, on his journey to return to the Great Khan to inform him of the opportunities for conquest in the Old World. For a legendary hero, we could add Ogla Khan, a vassal of the Great Khan who fought under his banner on numerous occasions, becoming widely known for his prowess in combat and his treacherous nature, both traits highly admired by his fellow hobgoblins. Ogla Khan, however, crossed the Great Khan one too many times, and at the Battle of Jianshu, when he switched sides to join the Cathayans, it was the last straw, and after the battle was won, he and his clan were declared outlaws and were forced to flee to the west. He would come with a pelt of Wolfgang, which is an enchanted fur taken from a great wolf, which provides additional movement speed, charge bonus, and armor piercing on the battlefield. I believe something like this will provide us with a great roster to play with, containing a mostly cavalry-focused playstyle, which has some additional punch with their monsters. Now that we have looked at a possible roster, let's turn our focus to possible campaign and lord mechanics. Firstly, there would be the main race mechanic, which all Hobgoblin Khanate factions would use. Even though the Hobgoblins are nomadic and would use the Horde mechanic, let's hope CA are able to improve upon them for Game 3, I would still allow them to occupy certain settlements, perhaps limiting it to faction capitals, as the Mongolians did settle several large cities during their empire's glory days. What would we do with all the other settlements? Well, we could give the Hobgoblins a vassalization mechanic, where factions that are defeated by the Khanate are automatically made into vassals, retaining control of their settlements and defense, but they pay a tribute to the Khanate each turn. This tribute could be in the form of coin or some other resource. All factions that are vassals would have to provide units to the Khanate when they go to war, so we would include a system where the player can select a vassal and then see a list of units that can be recruited into the Hobgoblin armies. This would allow the player to fill gaps in the Hobgoblin roster and would provide additional units for no recruitment cost and minimal upkeep. So what would be the downside here? Wouldn't access to free troops make the Khanate super OP? Well, each vassalized faction would have a tolerance meter that can be affected by several things, such as the player drawing too much tribute from the faction, the player recruiting too many units from the faction in a period, or neglecting to protect or assist that faction if they came under attack. There would also be several other factors that could cause the tolerance to drain and the faction to declare independence. These would be things like distance from the nearest Hobgoblin occupied city, cultural differences between the Khanate and the faction, so races like conquered high elves or dwarves would have a low tolerance to being a vassal, and diplomatic relations between the vassal and outside states. The units available would also not be the top of the line troops until much later in the game, and the current level of tolerance would also govern what troops would be displayed. When these things are combined, it would rein in the Khanate and bring an aspect of empire maintenance to the game for them, I feel making them more interesting than a faction that just raises everything they encounter, although if the player desires, they can do just that. In addition to the vassalization, I would also give them a mechanic for the breeding of wolves. Since their wolf mounts are such a large part of their culture and prowess on the battlefield, it would be a great addition to have a mechanic where the player could breed wolves to increase their combat abilities. It would be possible to create several different breeds of wolf mount, from smaller, nimbler mounts that are extremely fast, to large, tougher mounts that, while slower, are much more capable in battle. Additional options could include crossbreeding with other creatures to gain poison effects or fire resistance, or perhaps even magical attacks. It could be a fun little side mechanic where packs could be bred over a number of turns and then assigned to units. The player would then be able to upgrade a unit's mounts, much in the same way that greenskins are able to use scrap to improve their combat abilities. So there we have two possible mechanics for the race, but what about the individual legendary lords? Well, the Great Khan would have a mechanic where he has to manage the command structure of the Horde, something along the lines of the offices that the Vampire Coast have access to, though with a Hobgoblin twist. The office positions would only be available to Khans that have proven their worth on the battlefield, so each new Lord or Khan the player recruits would have a list of requirements they would need to have completed for a position on the Great Khan's council. These would range from winning a battle against a superior foe, to winning X number of battles in a row, to raiding a certain amount of gold. Once the Khan had achieved the goals, they could be used in the appropriate slots in the Great Khan's council, which would in turn unlock bonuses for the Lord and for the Khanate as a whole. There would be a special office set aside for shamans, with their assignment unlocking powerful army abilities for the Great Khan's army. Our second legendary lord, Ghazrak, would come with a mercenary mechanic, where every X number of turns, neutral or friendly factions would offer contracts for Ghazrak's horde to take. These would range from sacking a specific city, to destroying an enemy army, up to eradicating an entire faction. The more difficult the task, the more coin would be offered by the issuing faction. Upon completion, bonuses would be provided for Ghazrak's horde, based on the culture of the faction that issued the contract. These rewards would also scale with the difficulty of the contract and would last a set number of turns. So there we have some mechanics for the race, and for the individual lords to give them some additional variety, which has been something that is usually lacking in the base game lords. So what else can we say about the Khanate? We have looked at their lore, their starting locations, a possible roster with legendary lords, and even some mechanics. I think that pretty much covers all we need. So I hope that you, like me, will be crossing your fingers that we get the Hobgoblin Khanate come to Game 3 independent of the snivelling, mewling gobbos under the boot heel of the Chaos Dwarfs. I'd like to thank you for watching and encourage you to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. I would also like to mention that if you are a fan of the Dowie, I have a new mod called the Hammer of Grugny that I just released to the workshop. It adds several new mechanics to the dwarves, with the main focus being the ability to forge runewords to boost your armies on the battlefield. A big thanks to my Patreon supporters, whose continuing generosity astounds me, and a special thanks to Hot Apple Pie for the support since the early days of the channel. If you would like to support the channel, then why not check out my Patreon too. I'm Grey Tiger, thanks for hanging out, and I'll catch you next time.